Hi everyone, I'm Brihadaranyaka and I'm here to talk to you today about the Visuddhimagga, especially for the purpose of helping people who are primarily interested in studying the Buddha's words in the suttas to try to understand what the Visuddhimagga is, what these things called the commentaries are, how do we relate to them, where do we find them, what kinds of things can we expect to see in them, and what kind of things can we maybe not expect to see in them. For this first talk today, I'm going to be giving some general background and some explanation based mainly on Nyanamoli's excellent introduction to his translation of the Visuddhimagga called The Path of Purification, and just a few sort of beginning notes on the text itself and what kind of thing that it is. So first of all, just a little bit of background. As we know, the Buddha lived and taught in India 2,500 years ago. Now that's a long time, and since that day, every generation has had people who are interested to learn and interested to study what it is that the Buddha taught and interested to put that study into practice. And just as today, people like myself as a Dhamma teacher and a teacher of the suttas, I from time to time feel the need to give some explanation about what actually is in the suttas. And all of the YouTube talks that you've seen, all of the books and these kinds of things, these are all, in a sense, commentaries on the suttas. What we have in the Pali commentaries is a specific set of texts that record those kinds of explanations and examples, illustrations, inquiries into the meaning of the suttas. The difference really is, and the distinctive feature of the Pali commentaries is that they do so in a very systematic way, in a way that's quite unusual. There's not many examples. I don't know of any examples, in fact, where such a large body of texts like the suttas is taken on and systematically commented through in this kind of way. Now, clearly, these commentaries are an invaluable part of the tradition. They record the opinions and the learnings of the elder bhikkhus, and I say bhikkhus because I'm not sure that there's been any bhikkhunis who have written any of the commentaries per se. They surely have written some things, but and so they've written these and they've recorded their opinions and the opinions of their teachers and their lineages and so on. Now, obviously, people don't always agree with each other. Sometimes opinions may be dubious. Sometimes people have different points of view and so on. And this kind of thing we find mentioned in the commentaries fairly often, that they will cite, such and such a teacher says this, so on says this, and so on and so forth. So there's this kind of acknowledgement within the commentaries themselves that there's not always agreement, but there's a kind of discussion about what the meaning of things is. In fact, that's the actual literal meaning of the Pali word commentary. So the Pali word I'm translating as commentary is arthakatha, and arthakatha literally means a discussion of the meaning. So this is what we have. We have a record and a tradition of the discussions of the meaning of the suttas as recorded in the Pali tradition of the Theravada. Now, if you're at all familiar with the suttas, you will know that they have a great degree of repetition, that the similar topics are addressed time and time again, and that it's not an easy matter to give some kind of explanation or understanding of these things in a way that's going to be comprehensive. So exactly, sort of, how do we do that? How do we avoid repeating ourselves all the time? Well, it's not a problem that you can solve in sort of one step, but the way that the Pali commentaries approach that is that they begin by doing the major commentary on many of the important early texts and passages and ideas. So we have a central set of commentary which will explain the basic concepts, and then whenever those basic concepts appear throughout the suttas, then you don't have to explain them again. You can just refer to the central work. So that central work is the underpinning for the whole spectrum of the commentarial system. And that central work is the Visuddhimagga. It's difficult to overstate the significance of the Visuddhimagga within the Theravadan tradition. It has, in many ways, basically locked into place a system and a way of understanding which has prevailed for 1500 years and still prevails largely today. In doing so, it has provided us with what is undoubtedly the most complete and complex and practical advice on meditation found in any comparable ancient text. In fact, much of what we know about meditation today is taken from the Visuddhimagga through various sources and filters. If we look at the size and the scope of the text, we see it devotes considerable length, which we'll be discussing in a future class, to very practical matters like how do you arrange a seat for meditation and these kinds of things. So as a practical source book for the understandings and the practices of Dhamma in those days, it's indispensable, and it is really unlike any other ancient text. But I personally, I don't think that the influence of the Visuddhimagga is altogether wholesome. There are many people, of course, query whether the Visuddhimagga is always correct, and the answer to that is obviously not. I mean, we're all grown-ups here. We should understand that people make mistakes and that they don't always get everything right. That's fairly straightforward. What I think is more interesting and more significant is not so much whether things are right or not, whether things are correct or not. Getting things correct is trivial. That's what you expect from, your second-year students, that they should be able to look up the reference and get the explanation of the reference right. It's what you expect from Wikipedia. As a Dhamma practitioner and as a spiritual practitioner, we look for something not to just be correct, but we look for something to be wise. We look for something to be insightful. And in many ways, I feel that the Visuddhimagga and the commentarial literature which the Visuddhimagga is associated with has given the Theravadan tradition a somewhat shallow set of answers to deep questions. And it's remained largely content with those shallow answers since that time. And the almost spellbinding influence of the Visuddhimagga and the commentarial literature has restricted the scope of the Theravadan tradition to respond creatively to new challenges and new times. We remain so much in the thrall of the idea of the Visuddhimagga and the commentarial system that we overlook its limitations. Now, I think that there are good sides and bad sides to what we're doing, and I'm going to approach this as I approach everything, as an empiricist. I'm going to approach it as somebody with a critical intelligence, and I'm going to approach it as somebody with compassion. We shouldn't be surprised that we can find things wrong with sacred scriptures. To be honest, it's dead easy. And if you wanted me to sit here for a few hours and just list everything that's wrong with the Visuddhimagga, I could do that very easily. It's not particularly hard. But there's also not any particular point to it. When we're reading an ancient scripture, we are listening to the voice of the people of the past. And if we listen to their voice with either excessive devotion, with a credulous belief that everything they say must be correct, then we'll never really hear what they say. At the same time, if we listen to it with an overly critical mind, with a mindset that wants to dismiss it, then we will also never really hear what they have to say. So a mind of compassion is a mind that listens carefully and listens deeply and tries to understand, where is that person coming from? What kind of thing are they trying to say? And trying to appreciate them for what they have to say and for what they have to contribute. And so this is the kind of attitude and kind of perspective that I would like to try to bring to all of my scriptural reading, and I'll try to bring to understanding of the Visuddhimagga as well. Visuddhimagga has kind of become a convenient scapegoat for everything that people think is wrong in modern Buddhism and modern Theravada Buddhism. Some people are very fundamentalist. Everything about the Visuddhimagga and the commentaries is always correct, and the only thing we need to do to find the answer to things is to look it up what it says in the book, and that's as far as our wisdom is going to take us. This is a very rigid, very narrow approach to wisdom, and so naturally there arises a reaction to that, and people who say, well, actually this thing that Buddhaghosa said is wrong, or that thing that Buddhaghosa said is wrong. And so people imagine that this also is a kind of wisdom, to be able to find these mistakes and to be able to get the kind of right answer. The problem, though, is that spiritual life is not about getting the right answer. Getting the right answer is just the first step along the path. That's not what wisdom is. Many of the times when we find people criticizing Buddhaghosa, we find that they're criticizing things that are not fairly or well thought out. It's not to say the criticisms are necessarily incorrect, but it's just to say that it's not the whole story. We don't learn by dismissing things and failing to hear them. We learn by appreciating people and appreciating words and appreciating perspectives for what they are. Okay, so let's begin by having a short look through the introduction here in The Path of Purification by Nyanamoli, and I assume that you've all read this as part of the preparation for the course. And I will emphasize this, you must read the reading for this course, otherwise there's not really much point. Okay, so Nyanamoli characteristically gives a lengthy introduction where he puts the work of Buddhaghosa into its historical context. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the facts of that history, but I will read his opening paragraph, because this gives us a nice summary of the evolution and development of Buddhist literature, especially Buddhist literature in Pali. Pali literature falls naturally into three main historical periods. The early or classical period, which may be called the first period, ends with the Tipitaka itself in the 6th century BC. So it begins with the Tipitaka itself and ends with the Milinda Panha about 5 centuries later. These works, composed in India, were brought to Ceylon, where they were maintained in Pali but written about in Sinhalese. So this is talking about the text of the Tipitaka, and to note that they, as Nyanamoli says here, that they span a period of roughly 4 or 5 centuries. Of course, the main books of the Tipitaka, the Suttas, were composed in the early part of that time. And the Milinda Panha is the latest quasi-canonical work. By the 1st century AC, Sanskrit, or a vernacular, had probably quite displaced Pali as the medium of study in all the Buddhist schools on the Indian mainland. I'm not so sure about that. My understanding would be that Sanskrit rose a bit more gradually than that. And I would be looking to more like maybe 300 to 400 AD as the time of the primacy of Sanskrit rather than 100. But the basic point remains that over time, the kind of later linguistic forms especially Sanskritic forms, arose in prominence, and the earlier linguistic forms, such as Pali, declined on the mainland. Literary activity in Ceylon declined, and it seems fell into virtual abeyance between AC 150 and 350, as will appear below. This is an important point to bear in mind. So there's very little literature that can be ascribed to that period between about 150 AC or CE and 350 CE. The first Pali Renaissance was underway in Ceylon and South India by about 400 and was made viable by Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. This can be called the Middle Period. Many of its principal figures were Indian. It developed in several centuries on the South Indian mainland and spread to Burma, and it can be said to have lasted until about the 12th century. Meanwhile, the renewed literary activity again declined in Ceylon until it was eclipsed by the disastrous invasion of the 11th century. Second Renaissance, or the third period as it may be termed, begins in the following century with Ceylon's recovery coinciding more or less with major political changes in Burma. In Ceylon it lasted for several centuries, and in Burma for much longer, though in India about that time, sooner after, lost all forms of Buddhism. So this period does not concern the present purpose and is only sketched in for the sake of perspective. All right, so these are the three main periods that Nyanamoli is talking about. The early period for roughly the first 500 years, with mainly the Tipitaka and the early forms of the commentaries collected. Then Buddhaghosa's work from about the 4th century for a few hundred years after that, and finally the later period after the end of the Buddhism in India. And it's in that later period that we find the emergence of the Tika, the sub-commentaries, and the Abhidhamma Sangaha as the handbook for Abhidhamma study in later Theravada. Okay, so, all right. Now I won't go through the whole of Nyanamoli's discussion of the history there, and nor will I look at all of the various legends and so on of Buddhaghosa, but I'll just skip on to page 16, where we learn about what we can actually learn about Buddhaghosa from his own writings, which is very small. Buddhaghosa writes about the elder Buddhamitta, with whom I formerly lived at Mayura Suttapattana. That's in the epilogue to the Majjhima commentary, and also another comment to the well-known elder Jyotipala, with whom I once lived at Kanchipura and elsewhere. That's in the epilogue to the Anguttara. And the postscript to the Visuddhimagga says, beside mentioning his name, that he should be called of Moranda Chetaka. So we find a few place names associated with him. Nyanamoli gives a discussion about whether we can identify those exact names. But obviously there's not that much information there. And there is another comment that he makes here in the epilogue to the Vinaya commentary. And this is probably the longest statement that he's made about his own life. I learned the three Sinhalese commentaries, the Maha-Artakatha, the Mahapachari, and Kurundi. These are the three Vinaya commentaries, from the famed elder known by the name of Buddhamitta, who has expert knowledge of the Vinaya. Set in the grounds of the Mahameghavana Park in Anuradhapura, there is the great monastery graced by the sapling from the Master's enlightenment tree. A constant supporter of the community, trusting with unwavering faith in the three jewels, belonging to an illustrious family and known by the name of Mahanigamasami, had an excellent workroom built there on its southern side, accessible to the ever virtuously conducted community of bhikkhus. The building was beautifully appointed, agreeably endowed with cool shade, and had a lavish water supply. The Vinaya commentary was begun by me for the sake of the elder Buddhasiri of pure virtuous behavior, while I was living there in Mahanigamasami's building, and it is now complete. It was begun by me in the 20th year of the reign of peace of the king Srinivasa, the renowned and glorious guardian who has kept the whole of Lanka's island free from trouble. It was finished in the 21st year, and just as this was finished in 1 year without mishap in a world beset by mishaps, so may all beings attain. The quote ends there. All right. So that's not much, and we don't have that much personal information about Buddhaghosa. There are these various later legends and things like that. Personally, I would discount them as being history. I think it's unlikely that there's any real history there. There may be some record of some sort of general facts. The fact that he came from India. It's said that his motivation for coming to Sri Lanka was that there was he looked for commentaries and explanations of the suttas in India and couldn't find them. And somebody told him that in Sri Lanka there were still the commentaries, so this is why he came to Sri Lanka. Now, that story isn't really confirmed, and I wouldn't put too much weight on it. However, it does sort of paint a fairly realistic general picture, and it does very roughly agree with some hints that we have from the development of Buddhism on mainland India during that time. In mainland Buddhism, shortly before Buddhaghosa's time, we had a series of great Buddhist, probably the greatest Buddhist philosophers to ever live. Nagarjuna, who wrote his Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Vasubandhu, who was an incredible mind and whose works in 20 and 30 verses and other works that he wrote are extremely insightful and interesting texts. And Vasubandhu's brother, Asanga, who wrote an extensive commentary on supposedly on the stages of the development of the Yogacara, while Asanga wrote from a ostensibly Mahayanist perspective. In fact, a very large part of his work was commentaries on suttas, and many people have remarked that Asanga appears to be primarily an agamist, primarily somebody who relied on the suttas. And similar things could be said of Vasubandhu and Nagarjuna, even though in principle they come from a Mahayana point of view. In fact, if you look closely at their work, the main ideas that they're relying on are drawn from the suttas and are based on a deep and wide knowledge of what the suttas contain. Now, it seems likely that Asanga in particular was one of the inspirations for Buddhaghosa. There's been one or two points where it seems perhaps that there's direct influence. I don't think that Buddhaghosa ever mentions Asanga or quotes from him or anything, but certainly that idea of writing a sort of encyclopedic system that would systematically explain the teachings is something that Asanga also undertook. So even though in that period, these venerables were all writing in a period around the 400 CE, a few generations before Buddhaghosa. Now, it's an interesting little detail that in Vasubandhu's work, the Abhidharmakosha, he refers to in passing suttas on quite a regular basis. So he'll sort of quote a phrase or a word or something like that, and he more or less assumes that his readership will be familiar with that. A few hundred years later, a work was written called the Abhidharmakosha Namadika, and what that work does is that it takes all of those references and asides to suttas in the Abhidharmakosha and it gives the full text. And that's very convenient for us because the Abhidharmakosha Namadika was translated into Tibetan and currently work is done on that by Venerable Dhammadinna, who's studying and translating that into English so that we can read it. So that's great. And it has, a few hundred passages from suttas. But it's a curious thing, right? I mean, why is that? Why is it that Vasubandhu felt that he didn't need to explain these things? That it seemed he was writing at a time when it could be assumed that any serious student of Buddhism would know the suttas. Whereas perhaps a couple of hundred years later, that wasn't necessarily the case. So it seems that over that time period that there was perhaps a decline of study of the suttas in ancient India. Clearly this corresponds at the same time with the rise in the popularity of the Mahayana around that time. But it's not just within the Mahayana, because in a sense probably Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu and Asanga contributed to this. After their lives, most people studied their works rather than studying the works that they studied. And so the later education curriculum became more about studying those great philosophers and other ones rather than about studying the suttas. So it seems that this perhaps reflects this situation where Buddhaghosa was looking for accurate and reliable information on the suttas, but by that time that was becoming less assumed or less well known within India itself. Now that scenario I think makes sense, and I think there's probably something like that going on, but don't overinterpret it, right? We only have a few hints, so we're just talking about speculations derived from hints. We're not talking about facts. Now, when Buddhaghosa came to Sri Lanka, what he would have found was that the monks there were studying the Tripitaka in Pali, and they would have been doing so with the aid of various commentaries written in Old Sinhala. By Old Sinhala, I mean old from their perspective at the time. That is to say, from Sinhala that was 500 years or more old already by the time of Buddhaghosa. As mentioned in that last little saying of Buddhaghosa, there were multiple commentaries. He mentions 3 Vinaya commentaries, and then there are others for the suttas as well. So we have these multiple commentaries. We can imagine that these multiple commentaries would be taught in different schools, I guess. Perhaps different teachers would favour one or the other. It's a huge amount of text, so copying and maintaining all of that must have been a big job of work. And you would have started to have a growing problem where the monks, the students who were growing up, would have had to learn Pali to study the suttas, but they were also increasingly having to study Old Sinhala to be able to read their ancient works. I mean, obviously it wouldn't have been that different from the Sinhala that they were speaking, but the differences are starting to appear. So this is starting to be an issue within Sri Lanka, but it's also, of course, an even bigger issue for any Indian monks who are coming and wanting to study. So from their point of view, it would be much easier just to learn Pali and then have everything in the Pali language. So this is one of the jobs which Buddhaghosa did, was to take all of the commentarial literature and to translate it into Pali. So that's the first task he did. The second task he did was to synthesize all of those mass of ancient commentaries and to bring them all together into one system. Now, because he did that, the old commentaries have not been preserved. There is a legend to the effect that Buddhaghosa burnt all the old commentaries. It's a bit silly. There's no need to assume anything like that. It's simply the case that Buddhaghosa's work was of such quality that the old commentaries fell out of use and were no longer copied. There are perhaps 1 or 2 texts that were translated into Chinese that might preserve some of those old Sinhalese commentaries. But basically those commentaries have disappeared. So all we have left is Buddhaghosa's synthesis of them. Now, clearly that's a lot of weight resting on the shoulders of one man, right? That he comes to Sri Lanka from India. He's a bit of an outsider. He's got a bit of an outsider's perspective. And as so often happens within traditions, sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to revitalize what's going on. He assimilates a huge amount of material and then puts it into that new form with a relentless accuracy and consistency of style and intent. And I just want to sort of stop and pause here and just to try to sort of grok the scope and sort of almost unbelievable quality that Buddhaghosa brought to his work. It's unbelievable. Now, I'm no stranger myself to doing large-scale textual projects. I translated the 4 Pali Nikayas. I had the aid of computers and various other kinds of things that could help me to do that. He was working with palm leaf manuscripts in a nicely appointed room, it says that he had there. Did he have help? I mean, it seems reasonable to suppose so, right? You know, quite likely that he had maybe students or assistants who would keep everything in order and so on. But there's no real record of that. He doesn't mention it anywhere. I mean, compare this with the translations of Indic texts into Chinese, where they will invariably record who was doing the translation. It's usually done by a small team, maybe one Indian monk, maybe one Chinese monk, and maybe one scribe or something like that, who work together as a team to translate texts from, say, Sanskrit into Chinese. We don't find any mention of that with Buddhaghosa, but at the same time, it's not unreasonable to suppose that he would have had assistance. Nevertheless, it seems that the personality and the presence of Buddhaghosa to accomplish that task was very powerful. He really kind of brought something to that. And to be able to grapple with a sort of a vast mass of text, to synthesize them and to put them in a consistent form, and to just do that on and on and on, is one of the great intellectual feats of humanity, of anyone anywhere, to be able to do that. I get the feeling that Buddhaghosa in some ways was a bit of a frustrated poet. He gave quite flowery names to most of his texts, you know, the Manoratha Purani or the Samantapasadika and so on, which are, you know, the universal pleaser, or and so on, the filler of the heart's delight, or something like that. And I feel that when he was translating, he was devoted to this literary and this philosophical and this Dhamma craft, which he saw as a way of preserving the Dhamma, systematizing it and making it available. He was almost to a fault, was clear and explicit in how he wrote. One of the great roles of a commentator is to take things that are vague or inconsistent and to explain them in a way that is clear and consistent. And Buddhaghosa was excellent at doing that. His Pali style is immaculate, and his expression is always forthright and conveys the point without too much in the way of digressions. Based on some of the statements found in later legends, it's a commonplace these days for people to say that Buddhaghosa was a Brahmin, and that often it follows from that his word cannot be trusted. This is neither true nor is it worthy of any Buddhist to say such a thing. To assume that because somebody's a Brahmin that therefore their work is untrustworthy is racist, or perhaps casteist might be a better word. There's no reason why somebody shouldn't come from any caste and make a contribution to Buddhism. In fact, the Buddha was very clear about this, that the community of samanas was a community of people who had left behind caste, and that was their role. Their role was to step outside of those expectations that society placed on them. The early Sangha in the time of the Buddha obviously had many Brahmins, among them some of the great disciples of the Buddha, and this was never felt to be a problem at all. So this kind of idea, this conspiracy theory that somehow there's this Brahmin conspiracy to take over Buddhism and so on and so forth, this is all a bit childish, to be honest. There's nothing in Buddhaghosa's work to suggest anything other than he is what he claims to be, and that is to say a scholar of integrity who was trying to present the Buddha's teachings as best he can. Now, having said that, the historical claim that Buddhaghosa was Brahmin is, in my view, almost certainly incorrect. And the reason for saying that is that he seems to be, or the commentaries seem to be somewhat unaware of Brahmanical scriptures and teachings. I found an example of that myself when doing my research into the Satipatthana Sutta, where we have the well-known phrase ekayana. And ekayana is explained in the commentaries, given a number of different meanings. Yet it seems very likely that the actual meaning of it is derived from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which uses it in a very powerful philosophical text. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is not it's not an obscure or unknown text. It's the most important of the philosophical text in India at the time of the Buddha, and this particular dialogue is the most prominent and famous dialogue in the whole of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So any Brahmin would have known this at the time, and yet the Buddhaghosa and the whole Buddhist tradition seems to be entirely unaware of the fact that when the Buddha was using the word ekayana magga, he was in fact invoking a Brahmanical phrase, as he did so often. One of the reasons for being so confident that the Buddha was invoking a Brahmanical phrase is that in one of the appearances of the term, it's actually, the phrase is put into the mouth of Brahma in the suttas. So this is one example. There are many similar examples. One that was pointed out many years ago in the Pali Text Society Dictionary was that the fact that the commentaries give an incorrect explanation for the Pali word visa. Now, in Sanskrit, there are two words meaning all. We have Vishva and Sarva, both meaning all, both having a similar meaning. Now, for one of those strange accidents of history, only the word Sabba made its way into Pali, and the expected form Visa hardly ever appears in Pali. But it does appear in one place, and there's one reference to the word Visa in a verse somewhere. Now, anyone who knows any Sanskrit would know the word Vishva. It's the name of one of the Hindu gods, Vishvakarma. And yet Buddhaghosa gives an incorrect explanation of the Pali word Visa, even though it's clearly derived from that Sanskritic form. So once again, anybody, even not to speak of an accomplished Brahmin scholar, but anyone vaguely familiar with Sanskrit and Sanskritic forms would have known the word Vishva and Visa in Pali. So these kinds of hints taken together, and you know, again, these are just a couple of examples. There are many other cases like that, but to me, these show that quite confidently that Buddhaghosa was not a Brahmin and was not very familiar with the Brahmanical tradition. So let's put an end to this idea that somehow Buddhaghosa was a stalking horse for the Brahmins who was trying to somehow corrupt Buddhism. If there were any mistakes and infelicities that he introduced into the tradition, then let's give him the benefit of the doubt that they are genuine mistakes and the kinds of things that anyone, including myself and including anybody else, can very easily make, especially if you're doing such a lot of work. It's very easy to make some mistakes here and there, so let's have a bit of compassion for these things. Buddhaghosa did not claim to compose the commentaries. He did not claim to be the inventor of a philosophical system, nor did he claim to be in any sense really an original or creative philosopher. And in this way, he is very distinct from someone like, say, Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is somebody who saw what was happening in the Buddhism of his time. I'm not really sure what his time was, but probably between 200 and 400 CE in northern India somewhere. And he was arguing against certain readings and certain ways of looking at Dhamma and for certain other ways. In particular, he was trying to argue that certain ways of seeing the Dhamma were intrinsically shallow and that we needed to see through those to see through to a deeper perspective of the Dhamma. And that kind of philosophical argumentation, a particularly kind of philosophical argumentation that's aimed at a deepening of philosophical perspective, not just at an arriving at a correct view, but a deepening of philosophical perspective. That's the kind of thing we don't find in Buddhaghosa at all. And in fact, we rarely find that within the Theravadan tradition at all. So Buddhaghosa is not a profound thinker. He's not a creative philosopher. He's a translator. He's an editor. He is a educator. And much of the work that he did and the commentaries that he produced is for the purpose of providing an education curriculum for the young monks, presumably the young nuns who were there at the time as well, but we don't hear that much reference to the nuns throughout his works. So he wanted to do something that would serve as a framework for educating them. Now, one of the things to bear in mind is that literature at the time was less specialized than it is today. These days, for example, if I want to learn about suttas, then I'll get hold of a dictionary. Okay, I might get hold of a book, or say an Introduction to Buddhism book, or Life of the Buddha book. I might get hold of some talks on YouTube, explanations of things. I might get hold of some translations of some suttas and so on. And so we have these different resources. But in those days, really all they had was the commentaries. All of those different kinds of things were included within the commentaries. And the commentaries were there, and they would have been not only studied by the students, but also used as source works by the teachers. This is also, I think, very important to bear in mind that much of what we find in the Visuddhimagga is not really meant to be read as a book, like you or I might read a book. It's meant there to be studied by teachers to use as material for their teaching. And this is why sometimes you find that there's like a lot of different stories illustrating a particular point. The point is not that you have to read through all of those stories, but it's to make them available. Then a teacher can freely use those stories to illustrate points if it's useful at that time with that class. So if we think of the Visuddhimagga as being, and the commentarial system as being a reference system which is supplying resources for teachers and students, then the kind of the somewhat clunky literary form of these texts can start to make a lot more sense. Buddhaghosa, as Nyanamoli points out in his essay, rarely interpolated any of his own opinions. When he did so with humility, and he did so with hesitation. He would, on occasion, refer to different opinions held by different teachers. Occasionally he would say, well, this is what I think, but these occasions are fairly rare and on relatively minor points. So for anybody to argue about Buddhaghosa's interpretation or Buddhaghosa's position, this is a highly dubious basis for an argument. Buddhaghosa, as far as we know, did not put his position in there, and that wasn't his job. His position was to try to present the commentarial tradition of the Theravadan school that he was in. And look, does that mean that he was free from unconscious bias? Does that mean that he didn't shape things sometimes according to his own perspective? Well, of course, he was human. And of course, everybody does that to one degree or another. But again, this idea of coming from a sense of compassion and good faith, we have no real reason to think that Buddhaghosa was acting out of bad faith, and no real reason to think that he was doing anything other than what he claimed to do, which was to bring forth and to explain the commentarial tradition for a new generation. Okay, I'll skip over some of the remainder of the discussion in Nyanamoli's introduction. I won't talk about the different legends and so on. It is worth noticing, and I mentioned before about the hiatus in the Sri Lankan literature from about 150 to 350 CE. What that means from the perspective of the commentaries is that the material that Buddhaghosa was commenting on was already several hundred years old. Okay, so it wasn't like he was just commenting on the contemporary opinions of the monks that he found around him. All of those had inherited this mass of commentaries that were already old in their day. And So the commentarial material does not represent the innovations and ideas of the 4th century, but rather those of the 1st century or earlier. I mean, they could have been from any period of time earlier than that. Okay. So Nyanamoli points out that many stories about Ceylon cannot be dated, but of those that can, none seems later than the 2nd century CE. That suggests the material he had before him to edit and translate had already been completed and fixed more than 2 centuries earlier in Ceylon, and that the words present day were not used by him to refer to his own time, but were already in the material he was coordinating. Okay, so there's considerably more about the legends and histories, which I will skip over. And I'll just give Nyanamoli's summary of Theravadan development in Theravadan doctrine. Okay, so this is on page, page 28. The doctrines, the Dhamma of the Theravada Pali tradition, can be conveniently traced in 3 main layers. The first of these contains the main books of the Pali Sutta Pitaka. Second is the Abhidhamma Pitaka. The third is the system which the author of the Visuddhimagga completed, or found completed, and which he set himself to edit and translate back into Pali. With some further minor developments took place subsequently, particularly with the Abhidhamma Sangaha around the 12th century. Okay, so the suttas, Nyanamoli continues, the sutta has been taken as the original exposition of the Buddha's teachings, and the Abhidhamma itself appears as a highly technical and specialized systematization or complementary set of modifications built upon that. Its immediate purpose is, one may say, to describe and pinpoint mental constituents and characteristics and relate them to their material basis and to each other, with the secondary object perhaps of providing an efficient defense in disputes with heretics and exponents of outsiders' doctrines. Its ultimate purpose is to furnish additional techniques for getting rid of unjustified assumptions that favor clinging and so obstruct the attainment of the extinction of clinging. Various instruments have been forged in it for sorting and resorting experience expressed as dhammas. These instruments are new to the suttas, though partly traceable to them. The principal instruments peculiar to it are 3, that is to say, A, this strict treatment of experience, or the knowable and knowledge, using the words in their widest possible sense in terms of momentary cognizable states, dhamma, and the definition of these states, which is done in the Dhammasangani and Vibhanga. And it's worth noticing that the idea of momentary dhammas, kanikavada, does not exist in the suttas. In fact, it barely exists in the Abhidhamma even. And the definition of these states and dhammas also is a undertaking of the Abhidhamma. The creation of a schedule or matika consisting of triple and double classifications for sorting these states. We find this matika elucidated at the beginning of the Dhammasangani, the first book in the Abhidhamma, and the enumeration of 24 kinds of conditioning relations, which is done in the Patana. The states are defined are thus, as it were, momentary stills. The structure of relations combined the stills into continuities. The schedule classifications indicated the direction of the continuities. Nyanamoli goes on, the system found in the commentaries has moved on, perhaps slightly diverged from the strict Abhidhamma Pitaka standpoint. The suttas offer descriptions of discovery, the Abhidhamma map-making, but emphasis now is not on discovery or even on mapping so much as on consolidating, filling in and explaining. The material is worked over for consistency. Among the principal new developments are these. The cognitive series, cittavritti, in the occurrence of the conscious process is organized and completed, and its association with 3 different kinds of karma is laid down. The term sabhava, individual essence, own being, or itness, is introduced to explain the key term dhamma, thereby submitting that term to ontological criticism. While the samaya, event or occasion of the Dhammasangani, is now termed a khana, a moment, thus shifting the weight and balance a little in the treatment of time. Then there is the specific ascription of the 3 instants, the 3 khana or anukhana, of arising, presence and dissolution to each moment. One material moment being calculated to last as long as 16 mental moments. New to the Pitakas also are the rather unwielding enumeration of concepts and the handy defining formula of word meaning, characteristic, function, manifestation and approximate cause. Also many minor instances such as the substitution of the specific heart basis for the Patana's material basis of mind, the conception of material octads, etc. These are the kalapas, which you may have heard about on various vipassana retreats. The detailed description of the 32 parts of the body instead of the bare enumeration of the names in the suttas, and many more. So these are some of the doctrines which Nyanamoli is identifying have arisen in the commentaries that have moved on from the teachings in not only the suttas but also in the Abhidhamma Pitaka. The word paramatta acquires a new and slightly altered currency. So the word paramatta, many of you may be familiar with, often used in the sense of ultimate truth or ultimate reality. It's never used in that way in the suttas, and I would argue also is quite contrary to the understanding of Dhammas as taught in the suttas. Okay, so the question of how much of this process of development owes to post-Mauryan evolution of Sanskrit thought on the Indian mainland, either through assimilation or opposition, still remains to be explored like so many others in this field. All right, so that's just enough to give a very quick overview of some doctrinal developments and some of the ideas that we're going to find in the commentarial literature that will move on from that in the suttas. Nyanamoli gives a nice discussion of the overall content of Visuddhimagga. I won't read the whole of this because much of it discusses what we'll be looking at in subsequent lessons, but just the first part. Visuddhimagga is probably best regarded as a detailed manual for meditation masters and as a work of reference. So it's important to remember that perspective, that it's not meant as a popular book on Buddhism, it's not meant as something that's necessarily to be handed out to students, but it's meant to be something which is a source work, especially for meditation teachers, to be able to understand and to be able to teach the different perspectives for different people. There's a huge emphasis on meditation throughout the Visuddhimagga. And Nyanamoli goes on to discuss the rather intricate structure of the whole work, which I won't go into right now. But I will just wrap up this first talk by looking at the beginning of the text itself, because the beginning of the text itself is quite nice, and it also sort of plays into that idea I mentioned before, that I kind of have this feeling that Buddha Ghost is a bit of a frustrated poet. And it begins in Nyanamoli's translation, when a wise man, established well in virtue, develops consciousness and understanding, then as a bhikkhu, ardent and sagacious, he succeeds in disentangling this tangle. So this is a quote from a sutta in the Samyutta Nikaya, and you've got the reference there, you can look up the whole text there. And so the point of this verse is that it mentions essentially virtue, consciousness and understanding, sila, citta and panya. In this case, as often, the word citta is a synonym for samadhi. So this is a version of the well-known teachings on sila, samadhi, panya, or virtue, as Nyanamoli has it, or ethics, as I prefer. Samadhi, often translated as concentration. I prefer immersion. Or panya is wisdom. So what Buddha Ghost is doing here is quite subtle and quite playful. He's taking up this one little verse, which on the face of it is somewhat unremarkable. I mean, it's like 100 other verses or 1,000 other verses in the Pali Canon that will give a short summary of the path with a memorable simile, and it's a nice little verse that summarizes the path, just like 100 or 200 other verses might do the same thing. In fact, he goes on to quote a number of other verses that say similar things. But he then says, well, what really does this mean? And now I'm going to explain what he means. And the explanation for that verse is the whole of the Visuddhimagga. Like I said, I feel he's kind of a frustrated poet, right? Only a poet could write that much about just one verse. So this obviously is a kind of a literary conceit that has given him a kernel for being able to explain the whole of the Buddha's path based on one short passage and one short text. And it does, as far as we know, I mean, like I've emphasized that Buddhaghosa was an editor and a translator, but I mean, as far as we know, this conception or this idea of doing this in this way was entirely his idea. So it provided him with a very kind of nice, very elegant way of introducing this idea of Sila Samadhi Panya and for giving a manual on those, but giving a manual that's still technically a commentary on one particular passage. All right, so remember, he's a commentator. So the whole of the Visuddhimagga is a commentary on that one verse. The commentary on that particular, he gives a somewhat brief few pages worth of commentary on that verse itself, leading up to the discussion of virtue, or the discussion of sila. And we can see some of the methods that he would use in order to do the commentary, giving an explanation of the background for us to start with. So the origin story for that particular verse. Then he goes on to explain the metaphors. So this is one of the things that commentaries do, which, you know, you can. I think it often depends on your character or your personality. Is it really necessary to explain what every metaphor means? I mean, sometimes when a metaphor is more living, it's more evocative, when the meaning is unexplained, and when it maybe evokes some kind of response, you know, an inner tangle and outer tangle. Do we need to really know much more about it than that? But obviously, sometimes it is useful to explain the metaphors and so on. So he'll go and give that explanation, remembering that the explanation that he's giving here is meant as source work for teachers. So teachers should be studying this kind of thing and then using it in their presentation for students according to the needs of that particular student. And sometimes students might need more detailed explanation. Others, quick students, will get it straight away. They don't need that. I think this is like a really important point to remember when dealing with commentaries in general. Commentary should not be a straitjacket. Commentary should not be something that is forced on you to make you get the right understanding of things. The purpose of a commentary is to help you understand. It's to help you understand. And your understanding of the suttas is something that arises inside yourself. And it's the important thing is, what did the Buddha teach and how do we apply that in practice? These are the two things, is the Parato Ghosa, the voice of another, and the Yonasa Manasikara is the inner application of that. That's what matters. Whether it's correct in line with some commentarial system is really kind of beside the point. In cases where we're confused, in cases where things are unclear, where there's a reference we don't recognize, where there's a meaning that escapes us, then the commentary is there to help us. We can look it up. Just like when I counter a word that I don't know, I'll look up a dictionary. The point is not that I should study the dictionary and then ensure that every time I use a word, I never use a word in a way that's contrary to what the dictionary says. And nor is it to insist that this dictionary only is right and that dictionary is wrong. Actually, all dictionaries mostly are fine, but you know, you can find problems with any dictionary if you look closely enough. So the point of the commentaries is that they are there to help us if we need them. And they are indeed very helpful. As a translator and a student for Buddhism for many years, countless times that you refer to the commentaries. When I was doing my translation, I would always have that. The suttas would be there and the commentaries would be open in another window on my computer, and I'd refer to things whenever I was uncertain about them. Sometimes it was helpful, sometimes it wasn't helpful, but at least it's there. So our job as Dhamma practitioners is to disentangle this tangle. The teachings of Buddhaghosa and the writings of Buddhaghosa are there to assist us to be able to untangle this tangle. And in the future classes, we will have a look in some more detail at this and trying to see in what particular methods that he used, what are the advantages of those methods, and also what are the limitations of those methods, so that those of us who are interested to understand what the Buddha taught in the suttas can learn and can study with the richness of what the traditions have to offer us. So thanks so much for your attention, and we'll continue this in another class.